here on Star Television. We broadcast live from our Media One Center, 3 Mama Street, Bookfields in Feta. My name is Abdul Rahman Kamat. I have with me in the studio Lawyer Sonkita Conte and Adrian Fisher. Conte is the Executive Director for Mamati. Conte, good and welcome to the program.
Thank you so much, Rahman.
Also Adrian Fisher.
Thank you, Abdul Rahman. Good afternoon.
How was the holiday yesterday?
Quietly spent.
Quietly spent. It shouldn't be otherwise.
Shouldn't be.
Yeah. We shall be discussing generally human and child trafficking and its attendant consequences, looking at adoption policies, how they determine what happens in any situation of breach between two parties. We recall that the International Organization for Migration, IOM, concludes a training for civil society, media practitioners and government officials on the protection of victims of trafficking in person, TIPs, at the Makama Lodge in northern Sierra Leone. The primary objective of the training workshop is to strengthen the capacity of state and non-state actors to protect victims of trafficking of persons in Sierra Leone. Let me give you a highlight of some fact sheets. According to the U.S. Department of State 2018, trafficking report, Sierra Leone is both a source and destination country of forced labor, sexual exploitation and human trafficking in and from the country. The recent history of the civil war, the Ebola outbreak and the closing down of operations of major iron ore mining companies in the country to a larger extent exacerbated an already dismal situation characterized by high level of joblessness. But the question that largely looms is this: what exactly is human trafficking? This is how I bring in no less a person like Sonkita Conte to manage our audience, perhaps an acceptable definition, if you like, or accepted definition of what human trafficking is.
Thank you so much, Rahman. It's always a terrible issue to deal with and to talk about, because within society, everyone should have the ability to live and function and go about realizing their goals without fearing that some sort of harm, would befall them. And one of the functions of government is to ensure that there is security of person. So ultimately, when I am doing my job and you are doing yours, I should not fear that some harm would come from your end, which would affect my safety and security. Now, the law provides for us to interrelate in various ways. We can buy and sell goods, we can buy and sell services, and these are things that are allowed, by law. They are legitimate transactions that we could be involved with as human beings. However, one thing that the law does not allow, and this is, as a result of the dark history that surrounds it, is the trade in human beings. Human beings should not be for sale. Human beings are not for sale. Human beings are not supposed to be used in a way that undermines their integrity and their essence as human beings. And so essentially, human trafficking is the illicit trade in human beings. Essentially, we know that there are bad elements in society. There are people who they could sell anything, they could transact in anything. But the law draws a line that you can transact in goods and services, in mangoes and houses and cars, but you should not transact in human beings. Unfortunately, we do have elements within society who do that, and the law essentially prescribes that. It says, no, we cannot have people engaged in the movement of individuals, of humans, from one place to another for nefarious activities. So it could be for the purposes of exploiting them as labor. So you want someone to work for you, you don't want to pay them, you get someone transferred from the villages in rural areas into Freetown, and they work for you 24 hours a day, and you don't pay them. That is human trafficking. You want to run a prostitution ring, and you want compliant girls. You get young girls from the rural areas on the promise of coming to give them education. You bring them into town and you exploit them, you sell their services to people. That is human trafficking. You bring children in from wherever, and instead of taking good care of them, you exploit them economically by putting things on their heads to go into the streets to sell and not going to school and not taking care of them. That is an ill that the law disallows. So essentially, human trafficking is about that. It's an action that undermines the integrity of the person by viewing the person as a commodity, as a thing, as opposed to a human being with rights and with dignity.
Okay. Adrian Fisher, given the definition by lawyer Kita, one would be tempted to think that the process of adopting a child to a larger extent creeps into the whole definition of human trafficking if it leads to some form of absurdity in the adoption process. Could that be the case?
Well, not necessarily.
Okay.
Although adoption in itself has elements of trafficking in it, if it's not done properly,
Okay.
and if it's not done legally. But on the whole, adoption is an entirely legal process by which children who do not have parents, for example, or even those with parents, you have people who decide to adopt these children in order to give them a better life, which there's nothing wrong with that. But where the line ought to be drawn is where adoption is being used for the purpose of exploitation. That is where the line ought to be drawn. So it's not necessarily a case that when adoption in all its forms, there are problems with it, but yes, there are issues with it where children get trafficked, particularly out of Sierra Leone and other neighboring countries to other neighboring countries in West Africa, and all of it for the purpose of exploitation. And in this regard, the girl child is particularly at risk because they are the ones that are easily taken into prostitution rings overseas. So there are issues, and this is why a country like Sierra Leone, which, as you've seen, is a source country or even a potential source country, needs to look carefully at how it allows its children to be adopted out of the country.
Could this definition be rather faulty if I say adoption is a process whereby a person assumes the parenting of another?
Well, yeah, I mean, it's not flawed, but it's the assumption of lawful parental responsibility. So, for example, if I see somebody's child and I say, oh, I want to have this child formally adopted, then once that adoption process goes through the courts and the order is given, that person who was the parent of that child is no longer the lawful parent of that child. The adopted parent is now the lawful parent of the child. So you lose your parental rights to a child the moment that child is adopted.
So what are the underlying requirements for adopting a child?
Well, we have a law in Sierra Leone, the Adoption Act of 1989, which sets out in detail how children are to be adopted. In particular, there are specific issues like, for example, you need to get the social welfare to look at the child, and of course the overriding issue in adoptions is whether this particular adoption is in the best interest of the child, and that is the test that the courts would look at to see whether in fact, yes, this adoption order ought to be granted. The prospective adopted parents would need to have met the child, spend some time with them, know who they are, at least understand, how this child is and those kind of things. And then of course the courts would then look to see whether those processes in the Adoption Act have been followed, and balancing that in line with the Child Rights Act and the best interest of the child, the court will then decide whether in fact the granting of an adoption order to the prospective parents is in the best interest of the child. So there are several processes that go on with adoption, which culminates in the court granting a final order to say yes, this child can be taken, particularly in the area of international adoptions. Interestingly, in Sierra Leone, we have a lot of de facto adoptions. within Sierra Leone,
Meaning?
meaning where we go to the village and say, oh, Uncle James, I see your son, I love little Mike, I'm going to bring him to Freetown. That is effectively an adoption because you're taking over little Mike, bringing him to Freetown, you go to school, you put his name down in a school, you are now the parent, and there's not been any involvement of the court or, in fact, social welfare. But yet, you are now the de facto parent of that child because you've brought him from the village where, in some instances, he may not have been going to school, but now you bring him to Freetown and say he's going to school. So when the parents want to know who the father is, they'll be going to you. So these are all areas which I think we need to regulate properly.
Well, I'm sure, last one, Kitsa, what Adrian Fisher has just said is predicated upon lack of knowledge, where you will want to believe that Africa, we live in a communal society where you and I believe we are one keeper. I may go down to my village, see someone's child, and just say, for want of better word, I want to help and afraid up, with no due consideration. Then, with joy, that child will be given to me, on the consideration that this time a family became.
Sure.
You know, so lack of knowledge is a challenge in all of this.
So, my view is that culturally, we are known to be people who lend a helping hand. Sierra Leoneans are part of extended families, and so it is not uncommon for my nephews and nieces to leave the village and come and stay with me in town if I have the wherewithal, if I have the means to help them to have a better life. And so as Adrian said, it's quite common. And in that situation, I would say that what has changed essentially is custody. So the parent leaves, the child leaves his or her biological parents in the village, and physical control or custody of the child is now transferred to the person that is exercising this family member with the means. Now, because they have not gone through the adoption process, the rights that normally would attend that process, with respect to the parents who are adopting, would not necessarily flow legally. But in all practical terms, because they have custody of the child at that point in time, they have certain obligations that they are they're bound to see through with respect to that child. Now, I would say one thing though, in respect of the adoption process. My view is that particular process is actually a defense mechanism against trafficking. It is a response by the law to ensure that wherever there would be a transfer of a child, of a person from one to another, the court, the state, which has overall responsibility for ensuring the security of the person, should be involved. And so the adoption process is a mechanism by which the state looks at all of those different things. Have you complied with A? Have you complied with B? Is the child compatible with the prospective parents? Are the parents capable of taking care of that child? Is the child's best interest served by the adoptive parents? So it's a mechanism for the state to ensure that whatever is done, whenever someone is transported from one family to another family setting, the state is aware and it gives its blessing. That is why you would not have an adoption situation without the courts being involved, because the court ought to be satisfied that all the I's have been dotted and all the T's have been crossed before they would allow and make an order for adoption to take place.
Two things, Adrian Fisher. Can a child be adopted without the consent of both parents? That is one. Secondly, how to dissolve an adoption?
Well, let me take the second question first. I mean, once an adoption is granted under laws at present, it appears, and I use the words very carefully, it appears that it cannot be undone. So once it's done, that's it. The new adoptive parents now have custody of the child. The question is, can a child be adopted without the consent of both parents? Ordinarily, it ought not to be so. Both parents need to be involved. But then we have situations where there are single parent families. Maybe the father is nowhere to be seen, or the mother is nowhere to be seen, and the father is in control of the child, or vice versa. So when the matter comes to court, I mean, clearly what would happen is the social welfare report would state that, well, this particular mother or father is the only parent known for this child. So in that sense, you don't have both parents consenting. But then on the other hand, if both parents are together, when it comes to the adoption of that child, yes, they both need to be involved. But then, sadly, again, many a time the father is gone, there are issues, and then it's not uncommon as well. Even though the father might be away, but then he gets to hear that the child is being adopted, and then he comes and there is an objection. And then all of a sudden, the child is now a pawn between both parents as to who has the sway. The mother says yes, adopt, the father says no. So it does happen, but to answer to your question, it ought not to be. Both need to be involved.
Fast forward to the response of Adrian Fisher. Could that be a justifiable reason for an adoption to be challenged?
So again, the premise is the state should have responsibility for, ensuring the security of the person. And so even in a situation where you are the biological parent, if you do not act in the best interest of the child, the state can actually take the child away from you. And so that's the reason why you have the Ministry of Social Welfare, Gender and Children's Affairs, because there is an obligation on the parents with respect to their children. And so even where you are the biological parent and you are perhaps abusive of the child, you're not meeting the basic requirements of parenting towards the child, then the state can take the child away from you. And they could then put the child in the custody of another parent. And so if you find a situation where a child that has been adopted is facing, abuse or exploitation, now there ought to be a way to deal with that, and the state has to come in. So state mechanisms like the Family Support Unit, like the Ministry of Social Welfare, can come in, can intervene. And if there is evidence of that exploitation or abuse, the state can take the child away from the adopting parents. And
does the Adoption Act of 1989
yes
stipulates the age limit where a child will be entered into adoption process?
So of course, you cannot adopt an adult. The standard age of a child should be below 18.
Below 18.
Yes, and so you can adopt someone who's within that age range. Once you hit 18 and you're able to vote in an election, you cannot be adopted at all.
What will be the future implication in a situation where the process is legally binding, the court looked deeply into it and gave it a nod, then with time the child, after full realization that it doesn't suit me well, perhaps on certain consideration, Adrian Fisher, that the challenges the adopted children face, they will tell you, I'm not sure say I will go with this. Myself, I'm going to champion this in the court of law to see how short a decision can be reversed. Are there instances where children do follow the due process to actually overturn an adoption process?
Well, again, in Sierra Leone, there seems to be one school of thought that suggests that once the adoption order is granted, he'll tell you himself, that's it, it cannot be undone. But I look at it from the point of view that an adoption order is an order of the court. And if it's an order of the court, there's nothing specifically preventing that order from being inquired into or asking for court to set it aside on terms, particularly in a situation where you feel that, well, setting aside that adoption order would be in the best interest of the child. But then the argument goes again that, as Sokita quite rightly says, if you get into a situation where these adopted parents are now maltreating this child, you don't even need to go back to the court to say, well, let us look at that order you granted them. The state can simply come in and say, best interest of this child will take the child away from you. So in that sense, it does not happen where somebody has gone back to overturn, the orders of an adoption court. But in the UK, for example, it is possible to do that, because you can seek an order setting aside the initial order on time. So it happens. So, it's a question of how you deal with it, how you look at it, how you approach it, what's the best interest of the child. So there's a number of factors you take into account.
Last one, Kisa, again, I bring a scenario where somebody has concluded the process of adopting a child. But as time goes on, that person realizes a kind of diminished responsibility. Then the child in question will say, well, I can no longer face the challenges I'm facing in the area of grief, separation, and loss. Or it could be self-esteem and identity. I want to go back to my original parents. The same question posed to Adrian Fisher on the question of diminished responsibility, where somebody his sense of responsibility is diminishing. He doesn't understand what he's doing. Does a child has the responsibility to champion that particular cause for himself and say, let me go back to my original parents?
Well, it will be difficult for a child to be able to do that.
Why is the law not flexible in this?
Well, I think those who drafted the Adoption Act 1989 would need to answer that. But what I can certainly say to you is that there are proposals in the new anti-human trafficking bill, which is currently being drafted, which would effectively allow the court by statute to go back into that adoption where it was obtained by fraud, for example, and in situations where the court takes the view on the evidence presented before it that this adoption is not in the best interest of the child. So in a situation where, for example, there's been no mention of the father playing an active role in the life of the child, and then somebody goes to court and says, well, yes, we want to get adoption, the father is dead or he died 10 years ago, only for it to be discovered that in fact the father had not died and the father had been looking for this child. So that's adoption obtained by fraud. Then there's a question of adoptions that are not in the best interest of the child, that the court was not informed of a material fact which would have guided its decision in awarding the custody to that particular adopted parents. So all of these are matters which there's specific provisions in the new bill which hopefully should be enacted. But if it is, then that will help us a great deal to deal with some of these problems that you mentioned.
Yep.
Yeah.
I would also add that, mind you, the order of the court is not final. So an order of the court could be appealed. And so if someone comes in and is unable to challenge the adoption order that is made by the court on the grounds that Adrian has mentioned, like there was, material defects in some of the processes, or there was fraud or some sort of coercion, then an order could always be appealed to the next and higher court. And so you could appeal against.
Is it difficult in court to
order.
actually spotlight whether an adoption process seems to be fundamentally flawed?
Well, certainly, it's difficult, and I bring to mind the issue of the Hansi situation where this NGO, ostensibly trying to help parents secure safety of children, undertook very questionable adoption practices, and all of these things came to light only after the state instituted a commission of inquiry. And so there was a judge who sat and heard evidence and examined documents and examined processes, and then came up with reports.
Judge Showers?
Yes, Justice Showers, retired, Justice Showers. So you would see that it had to take the state and mechanisms of the state to inquire into the processes of that particular episode and to come up with a number of recommendations. Now, the bottom line was that the processes were essentially abused. People did not understand, the biological parents did not understand exactly what they were entering into. There essentially was fraud in the whole process, and that has caused a lot of anguish for both the parents, the biological parents, as well as the children. And they're trying to pick the pieces of their lives, but it's not been easy because, unfortunately, the recommendations that were accepted by the government have not been complied with. I recall that the white paper that was issued called on both the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and the Ministry of Social Welfare to facilitate interaction between the biological parents and these kids who were adopted. And it's more than 20 years now since those adoptions happened, and the kids were taken out of this country. And up till now, that has not been done. And there was also a recommendation for the police to investigate and prosecute those who were found culpable. There was some prosecution, because there was a magistrate court matter that found that there was sufficient evidence to put these persons on trial in the High Court. But that was where everything died. After the magistrate court found that there was sufficient evidence, nothing else happened to those who were deemed to be responsible. So certainly it does take the interference or the intervention of the state machinery to unearth some of these discrepancies in processes. Because ultimately, we need to understand that the court is made up of human beings, and human beings are they are prone to mistakes as well. The courts would act on what is in front of them at the time, and it's very possible that what they may be acting upon is replete with fraud and insincerity. So ultimately there has to be a way of going back to some of those decisions, and I think that was what the government did in the Hansi case.
Adrian, of recent, you facilitated a workshop conducted by the IOM in collaboration with the Ministry of Social Welfare, Gender and Children Affairs, through a project funded by United States Department of Bureau of Population, Refugee and Migration. One key thing that actually came out as reducing the risk of irregular migration through employment promotion and entrepreneurship support for the youth in Sierra Leone. How important was that training exercise?
Right, well, I was not a party to that particular workshop. I was at the EU-funded workshop to look at the revised trafficking law in line with an NGO, WHI. That's where I was. But notwithstanding, youth employment is important if trafficking is to be reduced in Sierra Leone, because most of the trafficking cases that we deal with involve youths who feel that the only way they can get a better life is to be outside of Sierra Leone. And the irony behind it all is they spend thousands of dollars, I mean in excess of $5,000 to go on a temple run. Now with $5,000 they can set up a business here, and the bulk of this money is what we call facilitation payments. It goes to agents who take them across the desert to North Africa, where they end up in jail in Libya, and their family then have to send thousands more dollars to the kidnappers in order to release them from the suffering that they're going through. So by the time they return back to Sierra Leone, they've spent in excess, sometimes up to $10,000. And there are others that spend more than that. So the question is, if you feel that you are an unemployed youth, but you have $5,000 to part with, why not invest that money in your country? But going to Libya with your $5,000 that's paid to an agent who interestingly does not even live in Sierra Leone. Most of these agents are living along the Mali axis, living along the Niger axis. You know, they're making a fortune, whilst our people are going out through poor advice to go and work in some of these countries. Quite recently we had of our female sisters going to Kuwait on fake visas, you know, to go and work as domestic servants. And most of them are still in Kuwait. They're crying out loud, want help from our government. We also have quite recently the fake Australia program, wherein somebody somewhere says, oh, we have this so-called program that will get you to Australia where you can go and work, you'll have a better life, but it's fake. If you want to have a better life in Australia, contact the Australian embassy. They will tell you how to migrate to Australia. They have proper, legally recognized channels to migrate to Australia. But then I always wonder why people would want to listen to the word of some guy who's living in Sierra Leone who tells you you can get a better life in Australia, but he himself is not going to Australia. but yet he's taking $5,000 from you to get you to Australia. So I honestly do not understand it. But I mean, I am hoping and I'm optimistic that our youth will become much more enlightened as time goes on to know that these programs are fake. They need not invest in them, and that the best option for them is to invest in their country.
That's when kids are concerned. Addressing some of these upcoming challenges, in your view, do you think it requires some wider education or superior policies?
I think we already have an anti-human trafficking law, which
Is
it are those laws enough to actually address?
well, so that is always the problem we have in Sierra Leone, the fact that we are in a rush to change laws without effectively applying the existing ones. And I don't think we have applied the existing ones. This 2005 legislation, what have we achieved with it since it was enacted by Parliament? I don't think we have fully applied the content of that law to the problem that we face of human trafficking. I recall coming across a couple of reports that criticized the government for failure to fund the task force, for example, on human trafficking. Now, basically, the law provides for a task force that would deal with many of these issues, ensure that there is widespread education on the risks of trafficking and on the risks of embarking on these irregular migration to supposed greener pastures. But we have not been able to fund the task force properly and get it going. So my view is that it's not about changing the law to have the most updated. We can have the most updated laws on the law books, but if we don't actually implement them, they are of no use to the ones that we are trying to target. So what I think we need to do is to really focus on implementation. The law could be tweaked, some improvements could be made, but if we make the improvements without actually putting resources into those provisions and bringing them to life, then we are not doing anything at all. And we need to understand that the mainstay of Sierra Leone is the people, and we have a very young population, and if everyone is wanting to leave the country, then that is a problem. And so I think education is crucial, and as Adrian said, $5,000 is a lot of money, and with the right kind of education and the provision of opportunities, I think someone with that amount of seed money could become a millionaire in dollars in this country if they are properly guided. And I think that's the reason behind the government's passing new laws to provide opportunities for small and medium enterprises. So there is this new act that was, well, not so new act that was passed to help develop small and medium enterprises. These are things that could benefit the youth in the country. These are opportunities that they could utilize. And once you apply that amount of money into a business, over 3 to 5 years, you've built sufficient capital that you're able to go into any embassy and apply for a visa, and you would get it and visit any country in the world. I think this is the type of education that we need to roll out to the youth in the country, because nothing is automatic. You can't travel to the UK today or to Australia today and make money and have the good life. It's impossible. Once you get there, you're going to struggle a lot, and if you don't die en route to those places, then you should count yourself lucky. But there is no magic bullet for having a good life, and if people think that simply swimming across the Atlantic would get them the good life, then that is a mistake. And I think education is key. Government needs to invest a lot of that, a lot of resources into that for the young people.
Edward, could I be right if I submit on the basis that those going up country to take their siblings, bring them to the city for domestic work, that could be equal to some form of adoption process that is pretty much challenging?
Well,
and how delicate is the situation?
Well, it is, because the trafficking task force receives periodically information about children who are found in Freetown, and when these children are interviewed, WHI, for example, DCI, Don Bosco, they find that, well,
Apologies, the trafficking, the task force on trafficking, how your composition is like?
right, the trafficking task force is made up of a number of key stakeholders, including the Ministry of Justice, the Ministry of Social Welfare, non-governmental organizations, Ministry of Labor. Everybody is involved in that. All the key stakeholders, the Sierra Leone Police, Director of Gender Affairs is there. And then, of course, we have other people like Don Bosco there. We have DCI, WHI, and other important NGOs as well that deal with this issue. IOM is also there in terms of bringing back those who have gone overseas. And the biggest problem that we get constantly in relation to the question you asked is that when complaints come in and say, well, where's this child from? Or is from some part of the country. Where are your parents? Well, my uncle brought me to Freetown, last year. And then next thing you know, is this child going to school? No. And this child was found on the street selling cold water or selling cakes and things like that, and they're not going to school. So it is a problem. And one of the reasons why, to deal with that problem, the new bill proposes a situation where if you're going to go and get a child from the provinces, you do not have to go through the formal adoption process, which effectively divests parental responsibility from the parent to you. But the Ministry of Social Welfare would now be setting up a database to keep track of these children. So you can go to Kenema or Bo and take a child from there, but you must let social welfare know that you've taken that child from Kenema and that child is now with you. So it will be registered. So at a click of a mouse on a computer, social welfare can tell where that child is at
Well,
any
the challenge,
given time.
Adrian, is my relative in Matutuka, how he or she will be aware that there is a database that will actually guide the entire process.
Right. Just like Sonkita said, there would be public education. And one of the things that is being reviewed, the composition of the Interministerial Council in the 2005 Act has been done away with in favor of strengthening the task force, which would mean that more resources would go into the task force to ensure that that task force would be an independent organization within the Ministry of Social Welfare.
So the question is, should the paramount chief be central in all of these activities?
Yes, the paramount chiefs are going to be involved in the newly reconstituted task force because their area of responsibility effectively serves as a magnet and a source for this kind of activities. So they're going to be involved, in it as well. And of course, the question of public education, a chunk of resources will be going into public education. I mean, take for example, Abdulrahman. Everybody in Freetown or in Sierra Leone, let's leave Freetown out of it. Everybody in Sierra Leone knows if somebody fights you on the street, who do you call? You call the police. How do they know that? Because there's been public education.
Okay.
People know if there's a problem, go police. So likewise, the public education would be saying to them, if there is a problem, go to social welfare. You want to take that child from there, go to social welfare first. So social welfare would be strengthened through that task force to make sure that they are notified whenever you want to go and take a child. And if you do not do that, you'll be committing an offense. So all of these measures are there to ensure that children can be protected. Because it's not just a question of looking at trafficking, but we need to make sure children are protected as well.
What will happen if the government could institute an action where they will go to the streets, randomly question most of these children selling cold water or any other market in the street, ask them who is responsible for you, give them the right answer, then you came to realize that there has been some infraction in the entire process where somebody has taken someone's sibling back to the city. What could be the punishments levied on that particular individual? Let's talk about the punishment.
So as Adrian said, that has to be captured within the framework of a new act or a revised Anti-Human Trafficking Act, because certainly it's the business of
So the
government.
question, are we late in implementing all of these things? Because if we talk of reenacting all of these things, we still don't have them
No,
working for us.
no,
then?
Raman, I would say that lawmaking is about a reaction, a response to what is
Situation.
happening
Okay.
within
Yeah.
society. I mean, that's the best form of lawmaking. So the problems, these are emerging issues. And so the law has to be flexible enough to respond to those issues. And I think this is an example of that type of issue that the law needs to respond to. Because we do this on a normal basis.
Daily basis.
You know, people go into a village and bring someone into town, and they don't take as much care as they would if that child were theirs. And of course the law protects children generally. So every child is equal in the eyes of the law. And so if you bring them from the village, you have to take, you know, good care of them as well, like you would yours. And I think what is important in this particular architecture is also the issue of decentralization, because the task force is not going to be able to do it by itself. And so, but where you have a system where the local councils are working, local councils would have committees on social welfare, committees on the environment, committees on housing. So these could be linked, and they could play those, you know, the vital parts that you know that would need to be played to ensure that from the community level to the national level there is some sort of a communication that's taking place and some sort of a tracking. And I think I like the idea of including the paramount chiefs, because within the chiefdoms, the paramount chiefs are meant to know, you know, the children they have within their chiefdom, and so the paramount chiefs also have sub chiefs who they could link up with, and so government needs to show that they're absolutely serious about protecting the you know, the rights of children at the most basic level, at the village level. And so making sure that this thing works at that level, I think, would be crucial, because we do have that movement from rural to urban on a regular basis, and children are almost always at risk.
Take us through some of the challenges and adopted children to face.
Challenges that adopted children face.
Mm-hmm.
Well, starting point, you're removing a child from the normal habitat
Separation.
into a completely new family where they have to adapt to the ways and means of that new family that they're going into. They might have to move away from their friends where they've been established for years, having to go into a new area and make new friends. Although children can be versatile in terms of, you know, moving over and making new friends, but notwithstanding, it does have an effect on the children. And this is the reason why countries like UK, for example, before the green light is given for adoption, all of these factors are taken into account. They look at where the child is going to be, what kind of life that child is going to have going into this new family, what kind of life they had back in the new family. And it's not unknown in certain instances where children who are in orphanages, courts have ruled that it's in the best interest of the child to stay in care rather than be adopted by the prospective adopted parents. It has happened. Because you see, all of those factors need to be looked at. You need to balance a number of factors together. And of course, you have a situation where, again, as Sonkita says, the adoptive parents might not even be aware of their roles and responsibilities. It could be this adoptive parent has never had a child in their life.
Mm-hmm.
So they don't understand what it means or what their roles and responsibilities are, you know, in looking after these children. And part of the rationale behind having this registration process for locally adopted children in the de facto area is to ensure that when you go to social welfare to say, I want to adopt little John from wherever it is, there'll be a social worker there to educate you, to say, if you're going to take on this child, these are your responsibilities. So you will be assessed as well to make sure that you're suitable and you understand the roles of a parent. What do you want to do with this child when this child comes to Freetown, or this child moves from Freetown to Bo? Or
Quickly, one thing
you
you've not mentioned, I'm not sure whether it's deliberate, it is the question of undertaking due diligence for the prospective parents that intends to adopt. Could that be feasible at times?
Yeah, but that is the point that I'm making, that the reason why that registration requires you to go to social welfare is for those due diligence checks to be carried out.
Oh,
Yeah.
Okay.
Because without those, social welfare would not agree to you to take that child.
Mm-hmm.
And this is the reason why the punitive element is there, that if you don't go to social welfare, you've not gone through the process.
Yeah.
If you are caught, you're then taken to court and fined.
Yep.
So that's the whole rationale behind it, to make sure the due diligence checks are carried out and that the social worker is sure that whomsoever is going to go and collect this child and bring them to wherever they bring this child to, this child will not be at risk.
Yeah, I think I should also add that it's useful for ongoing monitoring as well,
Yes.
because it's not just about determining that the parent is suitable at that point in time alone. For example, the social worker would need to know whether you have a fixed place of abode, you have a proper address,
Are you working?
whether you're working or you're doing business, whether the environment is conducive for raising the child, and the information that you provide would also help them to periodically come and check on the child. That is also absolutely important. So it's not that once you meet those requirements, that's all. No, the task force would also be recruiting social workers to go in, perhaps after 6 months, after a year, to check on the child. They could do individual separate interviews with the child, so without you being there to determine whether or not the child is comfortable, the child is okay, and there are no issues of abuse or exploitation within the relationship. So that is crucial, not only for the beginning points of the custody of the child, but also on an ongoing basis. The state has to ensure that the child is catered for and is protected.
I come back to my initial question. I have reason for asking this question, Adrian. Can an adoption child be returned to the birth parents?
Well,
Under which circumstances?
it is possible, but then I think a judge would be very hesitant to return a child back to parents from whence that child was adopted, because clearly the judge would have looked at the reasons why it was not in the best interest of this child to stay with the parents where he or she was. So if the judge has taken that decision on the one hand to say, well, I think you're better off going over there, I would be hard pressed to see a judge saying, well, okay, yes, you can come back here, where we had considered that it was not in your best interest to stay. So the chances are that child will be going off to another parent, another prospective parent that would be capable of looking after it. But I'm thinking I would be very, very, very surprised if a judge were to take that decision to say, well, let this child go back to the parents where we had thought that it was not in their best interest. I'll be very surprised.
Do you have a similar opinion?
So absolutely, and I think the underlying principle is the best interest of the child. Unless, of course, the parents enter into some sudden wealth and their circumstances change considerably, and they're able to economically provide for the for the children. And of course, there's also corresponding problem within the the home of their adoptive parents. But certainly not. I don't foresee that happening, really, because the state would have to. It's not just about returning the children to their parents. It's about what is best for the child. So that is the guiding principle. So is it best for the child to go back to the parents? If it's not, the state will have to look at alternatives. Is it best for the child to be put in the interim custody of another parent or an institution, as the case may be? And so ultimately, to answer those questions, the best interest principle is what guides the approach that will be taken at the end of the day.
Conclusively on this issue, how, as media practitioners, civil society organization, where, in your view, do you think we can concentrate our endeavor raising advocacy for onward education on some of the upcoming challenges underscoring adoption process and child trafficking, or better put, human trafficking?
Well, I think to start off with, again, to reinforce the issue of public education, the task force has put in place weekly radio programs which will be going around all across the country to ensure that people can hear and understand the importance of this subject, and that people who are approached...
Apologies, I may want to liken this issue about adoption and also the issue about public education on the consideration of rape. You go up country, communal settlement, somebody will involve into rape. Instead of pursuing the matter to court, what they tend to do, let's sit at family members. They don't even want to raise the issue up. Shall we sit as family members and settle this amicably? how do you call it, dispute,
Alternative
alternative
dispute resolution.
So if you are talking of education, right? With the best of education, the best of advocacy raised by Namati or the media, they will tell you, tomorrow they're gonna come and they will take me beginning but account of it all. Nothing else. No amount of education will change the narrative.
I think education, Abdulrahman, will be positive education. It's not a question of just saying going to Kamakwe and taking the boy and bringing him to Freetown. It's a question of, okay, yes, you can go and take the boy from Kamakwe and come back to Freetown, but before you do that, you need to go to social welfare and make sure that they approve you as a fit and proper person to go to Kamakwe and take that boy. But if you go to Kamakwe and take him without going to social welfare, you will be committing an offense. That is positive education, that nobody is stopping you from doing what you want to do, but you must do it within a regulatory framework. That is the key issue. And in fact, one of the things that to deal with this question of settlement, we are constrained many a time by cases not coming to court, and even cases that have come to court. All of a sudden, the complainant is no longer there. Sometimes the complainant will come to court, and then as soon as the matter is called, they'll put their hand up and say, "Pa, no one case again." Mm-hmm. So these are some of the problems we have, and it's for that reason why in the new bill we've put a measure in there to say even if the complainant comes and say, "Pa, no one case again," it's a state case, we'll continue with it. So these are measures, and they are put there for a specific reason to deal, as some kids had said, the reaction to the problems that we're facing.
As a deterrent.
As a deterrent, to make sure that, well, don't even bother. And you see, the sad thing about it as well, you have accused persons who deliberately go out to influence complainants and say, if you go to court, you're going to waste time because this is going to take forever. This case will never finish. And then complainants say, well, okay, well, if you don't want to go to all the time, let's settle it. So we're going to be in the business of letting the complainants know that even if you go and settle with that man, we're going to still continue with that case. So there's no point to even settle. Because this is a problem. It's a real problem, and it has hampered efforts of law enforcement to get convictions in trafficking cases. Because by the time the matter gets to court, the accused has already been to see the complainant. And many a time, as prosecutors, we don't get to know about it. Because if we know about it, we will charge those involved with perverting the cause of justice. But we don't get to know about it. And when the complainant comes and says, I don't want a case anymore, you don't know why he doesn't want a case. Because they will never tell you. So these are issues. And this is why we say, okay, well, rather than spending money and time investigating, because to investigate these matters is costly. To prosecute them is costly. So, but we will make sure now that rather than be frustrated in court, we will be able to proceed with the matter regardless of what the complainant says.
Honestly, you will not be the best person to answer this question as to whether the Minister of Social Welfare, Gender and Children Affairs is better positioned resourcefully to tackle some of these problems.
Well, I am, because I am in the task force.
Okay.
And I work closely with social welfare on this issue, and part of the problems previously was inadequate resources. So now there are provisions now that will go into the new bill to ensure that that task force and social welfare is adequately resourced to take upon this problem.
There has been so many arguments as to the jurisdiction of the ECOWAS courts. And I'm sure so many people you talk to, depending on who you talk to, they will tell you it borders around human rights activity, human rights issues. Am I right? Does the ECOWAS court deals with adoption cases that borders on the violations of one's right?
Well, so essentially, the ECOWAS court is a court that looks at the rights of individuals, and whenever an action violates any of those rights, then the court is capable of exercising authority over such a complaint. And so, irrespective of what what the circumstances are, if those could fit within the framework of what the court looks at, then the court would definitely avail itself of that opportunity to interrogate that claim. Raman, the fact is, trafficking is a wicked problem, and wicked problems don't have simple solutions.
It's profitable.
It is,
Right.
but then it's a complex problem for governments to deal with, and that is why I think the government is adopting a multi-pronged approach, and also bringing in different players, and so education is key, and I wouldn't want us to discountenance that, but then what we need to understand is the results are not automatic. I mean, we had to go to school for many years, okay, before we could call ourselves lawyers or journalists and all of those things. So I think government needs to ramp up its efforts on education and making sure that people understand the ills of trafficking and what is required to be done, and at the same time the government also needs to create opportunities within the country for young people to thrive and make a living. I think that absolutely is critical. At the same time, government also needs to improve on its prosecution record, because definitely people would need to be taught a lesson that if you're involved in these practices, you cannot go unpunished. There has to be some sort of a message that is sent across to those who might want to be involved in such an act. So I think it's a multi-pronged approach, and it does make sense for government to adopt that sort of an approach to the problem. But the key challenge is the resourcing. Government needs to devote a lot of resources to this, and I think the partners, our development partners, are also critical in this fight, because it is an international problem. Okay, it affects them, it affects us as well, and so making sure that we are connecting and talking to each other and providing mutual financial as well as technical assistance is absolutely relevant for us to crack this very difficult problem of human trafficking.
Edwin Fisher, it equally requires some regional efforts through collaboration to mitigate the impact of child trafficking and human trafficking too. Does it?
Yes, we have a very good working relationship with our partners in the sub-region, particularly in Liberia. Not long ago, you would have heard that a Sierra Leonean woman who trafficked children to Liberia is currently in jail in Liberia, serving an 8-year sentence. And that sentence and conviction were assisted by us here in Sierra Leone, working in close collaboration with our counterparts in Liberia and through Interpol for us to be able to track this lady and get her put behind bars. So it's happening. I mean, it's not easy to deal with some countries, but yes, there's considerable progress being made. Nigerian authorities are working very well with us in terms of repatriating some of our children that are taken there. Ghana is the same thing. Law enforcement in Ghana is doing some tremendous work with us. So yes, cooperation in the sub-region is key, because these are the areas where that I use as conduit to facilitate children being taken to other countries. And if we all have uniform laws, and this is why mutual cooperation is a key thing in the new bill, to ensure that we can put that cooperation on a legal footing, to ensure that those who are involved in this, particularly where the perpetrators are out in the sub-region, they can be brought here if we need them to be brought here.
I'm keen to know, out of curiosity, whether dealing with issues on human trafficking requires some specialized area in law, or any lawyer could just take upon himself to champion it from a prosecution aspect.
Well, I mean, our lawyers go through a lot of training for trafficking. I, for example, went to one such training in Botswana not long ago, about a month ago. I was in Botswana, dealing specifically with trafficking. More training courses are coming up where lawyers from Law Officers Department, police officers from Toku, social welfare officials as well are going to some of these trainings in Botswana, and also in the West African Regional Center in Ghana, wherein all the modern techniques in tackling this issue are being taught. Okay. So yes, training is key, and we're embarking upon that, and we're also thinking of having our own localized training where those who have gone to these courses can come back and impact some of the skills into our investigators here.
You have a common place dealing with the community people. What will you say to those who may just grab the joy of giving out their children to people because, for want of better word, idiot? What will you say to them? So this is where the education starts.
Absolutely, and I think government needs to focus on that. They need to work with the chiefs and all, and CBOs. And I think the women are also critical. The women can organize themselves. The women can reach out to each other. It is important that people understand that you're not solving a problem by simply giving away your child, because you may be creating more harm and more problems for the child and yourself in the future by simply trusting that someone would go and take care of your child for you, in a very far away place. That is no longer the case, as we have seen in many of the situations. So I think getting them to understand that you do have people who exploit those weaknesses and use these children and these females for nefarious activities. I think it would be critical. At the same time, creating opportunities where they are. And I think that is also a key challenge. That making sure that people don't feel as if that there is no reason for them to stay where they were born and where they live. That you need to move or you need to export your children to another area, for them to have, the best quality of life, or for them to have access to good things. So, as I mentioned, this is not an easy problem. It's a complex, wicked problem that requires a multifaceted approach to resolving it. So, from prosecution to community education, and even for the journalists, it's not just about hosting radio programs. It's also about doing investigative reporting. You could spend a lot of time looking into criminal rings or folks who are exploiting or abusing the process, and shine a light on those areas. So there's a lot that we could do, as a country.
Well, they just undertaking an investigative stuff, especially from the journalistic field, is capital intensive, but it pays a dividend.
Yes.
By way of creating awareness.
Yeah.
Otherwise, I want to thank both of you.
Just before you go, Robert, just one point as well, which has been captured recently when this review was done. We've realized that the issue of prevention as well is so important. And one of the things that we've looked at is the question of prevention orders that would stop people getting involved in some of these issues. Because what we do know is there are people who we know definitely are into trafficking, but we don't have the evidence to go after them. So we've now got prevention orders, and we're looking to get prevention orders in place to make sure that once we suspect that you're going to be involved in this kind of thing, we can stop you before you get to where, our children are now at risk. So again, all of those tracked approaches are what we're going to be using going forward to ensure that we can reduce it.
Preventive order act?
Well,
how does it work?
It means we simply go to court and get what you'll call in local parlance an injunction against this man, that he should not do certain things that we know he does to facilitate trafficking.
When there's enough evidence.
Well, absolutely. Or if we suspect that he is involved in this and he cannot give a proper account, then we'll ask a judge to give an order against him. Or in the event of a particular child that we know is at risk of being trafficked, we can ask the court to place an order on that child, a risk order on that child, to make sure that nobody can move the child from where the child is without an order of the court. So that way we're able to prevent somebody just taking a child from somewhere up in the north or wherever, or take them out of the country without anyone knowing about it. So we're looking at all of those issues.
Thank you so much, Adrian Fisher and Larson Kita-Conte, for honoring the invitation, being part of this program today.
It was great being here.
Great. Looking forward to having you in subsequent edition of this program. And this is how I draw the curtain into this edition of the program. Thanks to my studio guests, Adrian Fisher and Larson Kita-Conte. Till then, my name is Abdul Rahman Kamal. The program, it repeats, comes at exactly 11 tonight. So you'll have the opportunity to have the issues being discussed in the studio. Stay blessed.